Welcome to the March 29th, 2021 Historic Preservation Ordinance Ad Hoc Committee meeting. This meeting is called to order. We'll now say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to
the flag of the United States of America, to the republic
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Weird echo. Okay.
Tracy has to turn her computer down, I think, because I heard some feedback. She's on the phone.
Tracy, can you turn your phone down?
Yeah, Tracy's on the phone. Ask her to turn down her.
Is that the phone?
Yes. Her
No, she just
monitor.
needs to turn down her monitor so we don't get the feedback.
Tracy, can you please turn down your monitor volume, please? We're getting feedback.
It's not for me. I don't have a monitor on.
Okay.
Thank you. So right now we're taking public comments. Public comment during this portion of the agenda must be limited to matters on the agenda for action. Each person has up to 5 minutes to speak on a specific agenda item. Public commenters may leave a voicemail at 702-293-9208.
That's for voicemails prior to the meeting. I think we need the number that's up on the monitor for current public comment.
Excuse me. Public comments should call into 702-589-9629. Again, that number is 702-589-9629. Michael, were there any written comments or messages?
No comments.
Moving on with the agenda. Agenda item number 1 for possible action, approval of the minutes of the February 22nd, 2021 regular meeting. Motion to approve the minutes.
I'll move to approve the minutes from the February 22nd meeting.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Motion approved. Agenda item number 2 for possible action, committee review of the work plan. Michael, did you want to take the lead on this?
Just a brief overview. At last month's meeting, the committee had asked that the work plan be brought back as a tool for the committee to see progress on action items. And so, per committee request, you have attached the prior committee work plan, and you can review it and make any proposed changes.
Any discussion regarding the work plan?
Madam Chair, I guess the question I would have is where does everybody think we are at on the work plan? I see we have items 1 and 2 marked as complete. We have reviewed the code, the model code, as well as the previous codes.
I get the impression we were at item number 4. Well, to write the first draft.
Yeah, it looks like, actually, I would say number 4, item number 4, review and discuss background and draft information. We've also completed that. And it looks like we're on item number 5, which is to write, review, and discuss and approve the first draft. I don't know if we're at the point of approving the first draft, but we're certainly reviewing and discussing it. I think we're on the right track according to the schedule, although, well, there's no schedule really, just the tasks. I guess my question is, do we want to add some dates to this, or just maybe add dates as needed, depending on if there's a particular task that we need to address, such as working with the public or reaching out to the public and scheduling that. And that may be something we will need to, of course, schedule that and add some dates to that.
And we do have item number 4 on the agenda to specifically discuss the public outreach.
Exactly. So perhaps we'll take care of that at that time when we go over that agenda item today, this evening. So should we just continue to move forward with the agenda or the schedule as is? And should we decide to add dates to the schedule, we can, as we move along in today's meeting. So is there a need to actually have an action?
It's at the committee's preference. I think this is just a working document, a tool
Right.
for the committee to evaluate at each meeting.
Any other comments regarding the schedule, or changes or additions? Tracy, anything?
I just add that, I think, yeah, we're right on, I think, of getting the first draft out there. In regard to the exterior design guidelines and the certificate of appropriateness, those are included in this draft, although the documents themselves aren't. I think we're still kind of headed in the right direction. We're a little bit, I guess, off with regards to number 5, not off, but I think in discussions we've had before, we weren't really going to dive into those as part of this group, but maybe clarification on that matter. Any discussion on that?
Good points. I guess they should continue to be maybe reviewed and discussed as needed, but there is not going to be any revision or drafting of the guidelines or the certificate of appropriateness. Or that's not what the ad hoc committee is established for.
Right, but certainly have in mind that those are something that will be forthcoming, and so to continue to keep them in the drafts that we are approving. So I just would keep that in mind.
Thank you. Any other comments? Hearing no other additions, comments, let's move on. Let's see. To agenda item number 3 for possible action, committee review of the Shippo model ordinance. So,
I can just do a brief overview. So, before you is the Shippo model ordinance as drafted and incorporated by Ms. Walker. It includes her analysis of comparing the model ordinance to the city's existing ordinance as well as the city's former 2000 ordinance. So you can see the comparisons between the three. At the last meeting, the committee wanted the opportunity to be able to review this and provide feedback. We received feedback from Chair Davenport and Member Turner. Those two feedback items are incorporated in your packet for your discussion.
May I just add, the ordinance drafted by me, I wouldn't say it was drafted by me, it was converted into a Word document from PDF, and I just put in some comments. So I didn't actually do any drafting. It is still the intact Shippo model ordinance with the HPO. I reviewed the comments, and thank you so much, committee members, for providing those. I just overall would like to say that, an ordinance is a foundational structure for a program or a commission such as this. It's not required to be exhaustive or comprehensive. There are rules and regulations you can provide, the guidelines, things like that, that if there needs to be more detail, it doesn't necessarily have to be an ordinance. I would also say that the commission is not its own entity. The commission is a public body of the city. So just making that clarification, and with that, I think, not to tell the committee what to do, but being as Chair Davenport, your changes were very comprehensive. I think that it would be easiest to probably go through that as your discussion platform for today's meeting.
thank you.
Madam Chair, I think one thing that we should probably see if we can agree on as far as a recommendation to City Council for this. At our last meeting, we did discuss, there were two versions of the Shippo model code, one with an HPO and one without. And the discussion was that the city would not likely have an HPO as a city employee. However, we would look to have some outside expert, whether it be one company or companies that are brought in as needed. So I'm not sure what we need. I know when I looked over the changes you had suggested, I think you tried to address that by talking about an HPP rather than an HPO. And so I guess my question for the city attorney would be, does that need to be incorporated in the ordinance or some reference? Can that be identified in the definitions, or how might that work?
I will just start off by saying the Historic Preservation Officer, there's no legal consequence of calling the officer an officer versus a professional. It wouldn't create or make that individual an employee by nature of the designation or the term that's used. That said, it's within this committee's purview if they want to recommend, if they feel that the term is more term professional is better for the public perception. That's obviously within this committee's purview, and there's no issue with changing it to professional versus officer.
Well, I guess my question is that, you know, we may, through the course of time, deal with various companies or individuals who have the background that is deemed necessary. So is there anything that would need to be done within the ordinance to address that we're not necessarily talking about one individual or one position, but a resource that, you know, does that require definition, or the HPO or HPP designation would just apply to whomever the city council designated to do certain work?
The latter, the HPO would apply to whoever the city designates as the HPO. It doesn't have to be a defined term in the ordinance, but if the committee feels that's more clear, they can define that role more clearly.
So I may have addressed that by defining what a historic preservation professional is within the in the beginning of the draft ordinance with the comments that I made. I agree that we should change it from perhaps, or clarify it a little bit to not be just a certain person, but a person and or an organization or company, or, I mean, I don't know, taking it from the singular to the plural if as necessary. I guess just trying to figure out logistically how to do this. And Tracy, are you looking at the same thing?
Yes, I can see it. So, yeah, the only reason we even have that is really, it's part of Shippo's recommendation, correct? So, I don't know, are they very specific versus a professional versus an officer in the requirement that they have or not?
I don't think it was defined. It was not at all defined in their model code. It definitely did. There was not a definition and anywhere, I think, in the model code as far as what a historic preservation officer does or
That's
is.
correct. Yes, and there doesn't need to be. If this committee feels that it would be more clear to the public, or feels that role should be defined in ordinance, it can be, but it doesn't have to be.
I felt it was necessary to add a definition of what the historic preservation professional is for the purpose of public transparency, and to distinguish what they are responsible for in reviewing projects, in particular certificates of appropriateness. And it's to distinguish between folks who are on the Historic Preservation Commission versus city staff, which are the primary entities who are reviewing historic preservation projects. And therefore, it's defined that they meet, or they have a demonstrated interest, and historic preservation meets the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards, and then, you know, further defines generally what those types of positions are in historic architecture, urban design, archaeology, landscape architecture, et cetera. Which those are professions and or, as well as the Secretary of Interior's qualification standards, those are generally not qualifications or expertise that's held currently within the city or by the Historic Preservation Commission.
I would have a suggestion that for your definition, the one that you have offered here, it starts on page 53 of the packet. Rather than going into the detail that's there, because again, we're not going to be certain of every situation that's going to come up. but to leave that in the type of wording where it would say that they have the recognized experience and professional certifications necessary to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards.
That would work. Do we want to go through then, I guess I could just start at the beginning and go through the version with my comments and I guess go by section and see if there are any comments or additions or slashing and burning. Does that sound like a plan?
I would just make the comment that when we do get into these definitions, you know, you have, for instance, a definition here for a building official. I believe, and Mr. Mays may be able to confirm or otherwise advise on this, but within our code, we have a designation of a building official.
That is correct.
And to include those definitions within this ordinance, and this may be something Ms. Walker can comment on, if we're defining things that are defined elsewhere, and if those definitions elsewhere change, then that requires some change in this ordinance. So if something is known or defined by ordinance elsewhere, to include it in this ordinance, I think is going to, down the road, cause some conflicts in needing to clean things up. Usually when laws or ordinances are written, you know, this particular ordinance has nothing to do really with a building official, although it refers to a building official in certain capacities. But if the building official is defined elsewhere within the city code, that's usually not necessary to define it within this. But again, I'll look to Ms. Walker or Mr. Mays for their thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, there are certain terms that are defined elsewhere, such as building official, that would be referring to the same definition. A way we could do that if the committee does want to see a definition is we can say that building official has the definition ascribed to it in Boulder City Code and cite the section, but it's not necessarily necessary. You know, I will say that in general, the definitions do not need to be exhaustive. The definitions really are just for sort of key terms that really, when somebody's reviewing and interpreting the ordinance, that those terms would need to be defined, like the term alteration. You know, that is something that would probably need to be clearly defined, since that's a trigger for review of and issuance of a certificate of appropriateness. So, you know, otherwise, the definitions aren't necessarily necessary unless they're unique for really carrying out this chapter.
I kind of grappled with that as far as when I see those titles or words that I didn't know what a building official was. Personally, and I think we had a conversation about that, like, what is that here in Boulder City? And so I simply added, I don't care if it's defined or how it's defined, but I think because it is addressed in the ordinance, I guess it'd be nice to, put a finding aid to where do you find that definition of a building official? Because I actually couldn't find it on our website or on the city's website as far as what is the definition of a building official, except when you go into city code, you can find it. So I wasn't sure, I just added per NRS, but if you want to clarify it even further, I think that would be handy to have that in here, personally. And I think that was like the only one that, well, there was, let's see. The other definitions are pretty close to meeting standards identified in, National Register nomination, information, Secretary of Interior standards, and other ordinances, other historic preservation ordinances throughout the country. As well as, I think, from our 2000 ordinance, there was some good definitions in there that I found were pretty handy. So that's why I felt it was important to add that here. And they're pretty general. They can get more specific, but I believe I address if there's any specificity to any of these definitions, that those would be handled in the design guidelines. Any question about, do you think there's too many definitions or not enough? Do you think it's helpful?
I didn't
Can I jump in?
I didn't have any issues with it. I thought it was very good. Everything's clearly defined for the public, and I don't think it hurts anything to have such a long list of definitions.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. I found, I liked that you added the definitions. I thought the Shippo one was lacking, but it had like 5 definitions. I think they really were lacking to clarify the intent of the ordinance. There was only 3 things that I wanted to comment on the definitions, and then I'd like to back up a little bit and go to the purpose statement. But for the definitions, in the 2000 code, there is a definition of archaeological site, and it's mentioned in this ordinance only a few times, but I didn't know. I just wanted to throw that out there if we thought that needs to be added as a definition or not. The next one was the community planning department. We have it defined as a definition of a community planning department, but then throughout the document, it flips back and forth between community planning department and community development department. So I think we just need to make that uniform throughout the document, whichever one you want to use. Since we do have, currently it's called a community development department, I might suggest using that definition and then changing it throughout the document to be universal. And then the maintenance and repair, I just had a question about that, about really maybe giving an example of that, whether that's to the design guidelines or some other document. But that was my concern of people just saying, oh, I'm just maintaining my building and not really having a distinction between what the maintenance is versus doing something that changes or alters the building itself. And then later on in the document on page 78, under section D, it talks about ordinary maintenance. So I think we need to just kind of make those uniform between maintenance, repair, ordinary maintenance, define what those are, and then use them uniformly throughout the document. So those are the 3 definition comments that I had.
I think what you're, let me just, to be clear, it's routine maintenance or repair is under the definitions, but it's ordinary maintenance throughout the document, correct?
Yeah, just one time I saw ordinary maintenance, and it was on page 78 of our packet, under item D.
Okay.
Which it was an exception to, I think, a certificate of appropriateness or something. So it kind of needs to probably be clarified if it's going to be an exception to something.
Committee members, I would add that, once this committee makes some recommendations on this ordinance, I will actually bring a draft to you to look at based on this committee's recommendations. So you don't, and when I do that, I will go through and edit for consistency and make sure we're using consistent terms. So I wouldn't, I guess, worry too much about that. I mean, once when another draft is brought to you, we'll have those edits. And I do have some recommendations on the definitions if the committee is amenable to that.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was page 73 of the packet under D, not 78. I can't read my own handwriting.
Thank you.
Councilman Folda, I know you wanted to go back to the purpose statement, but would you be amenable to discussing the staff recommendations on the definitions first?
Sorry,
or-
can you repeat the last statement?
Sure. You had indicated that you wanted to move to the purpose statement, and I was wondering if you were okay with me going through the staff recommendations on the definitions before going back to the purpose statement.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Well, first, is there any discussion about Councilman Folda's recommendation on archaeological site and whether that should be a defined term?
I think that's a great idea.
I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian here. Since this is a preservation code and it is something that the state of Nevada has developed, and it refers to things like CLG and that sort of thing. I know Member Turner has said, you know, we want to inform the public. Absolutely, we want to inform the public. But we also want to have an ordinance that is workable and contains the definitions that are really important to preservation, and not trying to write the Secretary of Interior standards. Those already exist, and in order to have a recognized historic district, there are certain things that encompass that already within those definitions. So again, my concern is that we're trying to make this the kitchen sink type thing where we've got every possible thing in there, and those things are included elsewhere. They're mentioned elsewhere, and you know, when you say that you're going to abide by the Secretary of Interior standards, that's the reference point. So to try and define every possibility like CLG, well, again, I think just by stating that it would be a certified local government, that's defined by the state. It's not defined by this ordinance. So I think there are several definitions in here that probably are expanding this beyond where it needs to go, because those things are defined elsewhere. But again, I would like to stick closer to the state statute because of defensibility at some future date, rather than trying to rewrite this code, this ordinance, by this group here. But that's just my position on it, so.
I guess I should add that the code is relative to historic resources, and historic resources include structures, buildings, sites, as well as archaeological resources. And I think this references one of the tasks of the commission is to address Section 106 on projects, federal projects. And oftentimes those projects include archaeological resources. And those resources are also identified in the Secretary of Interior standards as far as how to treat them.
Right, and
But there's also the National Register.
Okay, and I'm not trying to exclude an archaeological site. That's not my intent at all. My intent is to say within the ordinance that Section 106 is going to be the basis for these, rather than trying to rewrite Section 106 into this ordinance. So an archaeological site, absolutely, it can be a historic asset. Again, I don't think we need to include Section 106 within this. I think it's possible to say that we're going to go by those guidelines, which could change at some point, rather than trying to write them into this particular document. Again, if the intent of this committee is to come up with a recommendation that will be a standalone thing and not have to refer to Section 106 or Shippo or CLG or any of that, if the idea is to make this something that details every aspect of preservation, then yes. I don't believe that's what's appropriate for an ordinance, is the point I'm trying to make.
I guess when I went and made comments, I didn't revise it or rewrite it. I thought more like I was clarifying and adding, I guess, and I'm a...
Right, and again, I'm just
Splitter rather
stating
than a
my
lumper.
position as far as how to come up with an ordinance for the city, is to not try and rewrite all aspects of historic preservation into the ordinance. I think it's fine to do that by reference to standards that are already out there and may change over time. That's my only intent, is rather than trying to come up with something like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior has already done, is to refer to that and say that's the standards that we would go by. Those are the definitions that we would use. But once again, if the intent of this committee is to write something like that that's all encompassing and try and address every possibility, well, that's a possibility. I just don't think that's the direction we would go with an ordinance.
So you're suggesting that because one of the definitions is for rehabilitation, it can be found in the Secretary of Interior standards, that it should be removed, and we should just define the Secretary of Interior standards with a link to go find those standards.
Again, I think there can be accompanying information that is not part of an ordinance, is not written into city code, can be part of the architectural guidelines that would be established later by, a professional, either firm or person. I just don't, again, think that's necessary within our ordinance. I understand that that's my opinion, and that's all I'm stating it as, is that's just my feeling about an ordinance like this, is we don't have to rewrite everything. We can refer to things like CLG status, which is defined elsewhere.
Got it.
Legally speaking, the definition section is really about defining terms necessary for interpretation of the ordinance. It should not be, it does not need to be exhaustive in nature. The definitions are usually given their plain meaning in the context of which they're used. So it actually is my recommendation later on to the definitions that are specific to treatment, such as renovation and rehabilitation. I would recommend removing those, because those really go to more so the SOI standards, and analyzing when it goes before the commission, which is what the improvements will need to do, which kind of already cross-references the SOI standards. Now, like terms like alteration, things like that, the community needs to know, okay, what's triggering this need for a certificate of appropriateness? And those terms are definitely, need to be defined so that the public is aware as to when they're required to get the certificate and when they're not required to. As far as, exhaustive definitions, and I can go through each one if you'd like, and whether, just to tell you which ones I recommend removing, which ones I recommend changing. And I will say too, it is important that if we do choose to define a term, we make sure it is consistent with the external references that we are using, so that we're being so that we don't have conflicting definitions.
So can I ask, I guess I can live with these definitions can go away, but I think they need to be codified somewhere else, and therefore, would that happen under the design guidelines?
They can be under the design guidelines, or if they're already defined terms within the SOI standards, then I don't know that they have to be.
I guess when I mean codified, meaning they are, yes, the Secretary of Interior standards are there, but oftentimes they are not readily apparent or illustrated when somebody is seeking a certificate of appropriateness.
I guess if you're, what I'm hearing, I think maybe is the SOI standards aren't illustrative of what the homeowner needs to do. I mean, that definitely can be addressed more in the guidelines. If the SOI standards are insufficient, then, those things could be addressed more in the guidelines.
Or it's a combination of illustrative, but also repetitive.
Yeah, the guidelines will be what, and I don't want to speak for Michael, but the guidelines will be what the certificate of appropriateness will be measured towards and what they have to comply with. Is that accurate, Michael?
Correct, and as this committee has already discussed, that would be an opportunity to work with the Historic Preservation Committee for the development of those guidelines and to include those definitions with those guidelines, because I think what I'm also hearing is the concern that the property owners have a clear understanding of their obligations and how it's defined. And it may not be necessary here in the ordinance, but in those specific guidelines, including that information. And maybe, Chairman Davenport, just to kind of frame the issue and how the committee could move forward, as Ms. Walker has already mentioned, after the committee gives us guidance, consensus on what they'd like to see in the ordinance, we will be reviewing the code to see if there are any conflicts with the rest of the city code and provide that back to you. I think we can also provide you information on where some of these definitions may exist elsewhere, but that doesn't preclude including them in the guidelines, because again, that's a different purpose. That's to help educate and communicate to the applicant the different definitions that they need to move forward. And then my third recommendation, after we receive guidance from the committee this evening, and before we bring back the recommended ordinance to you, we also consult with Shippo and get their input on the changes so you have their insight before moving forward with your recommendation to the community and to the council and Historic Preservation Committee.
Thank you. So I guess continue on, but or maybe we all agree that I guess the definitions can live here or elsewhere. I don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak.
Would it be helpful if staff if we went through each definition and kind of got the committee's consensus on whether it should be included or not? Or?
I was just about
Can I
to
weigh in?
suggest that.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. I would just say that if these definitions are defined elsewhere, then we refer to them and where they're designated and where to look for them. I understand, that yes, the definitions can change over time, and the reference materials that we are referring to can change over time, and so referencing at least where that designation is coming from. I didn't really see it very clearly in the Shippo ordinance where we're really saying that we're doing the state of the interior or CGL or those kind of things. It doesn't really reference those. So if we take out the definitions because they're referenced in those other documents, I would just more strongly emphasize where we're getting those designations from, if that makes sense.
It does to me, and I just wonder if this is where I was coming from, where within the ordinance, if we want to emphasize that these definitions can be found in the design guidelines or the CLG manual, but we also say it's not only emphasized, but those definitions have to be adhered to.
Right, and you want to have the definitions be uniform, right? So we don't want to make up our own definitions that are adverse to or conflict with somewhere else. But then let's put in there where we're getting the definitions from. So if it's a state and interior and those techniques that we're using or those definitions we're using, I don't really see a spot where it's referencing that in this document right now.
Got it.
So that would be my recommendation. If staff wants to go through with the next one and eliminate what definitions are, not uniform with other codes or ordinances, and then make that recommendation, but then also add in where we're getting those recommendations, or, that they're found either in the interior or CLG definitions or somewhere else.
So I will just say that there's not a lot of jargon in here in the ordinances that really require that cross-reference to the SOI and standards. I mean, really what this ordinance does is create a structure for committee review of, 1, historic designation, or 2, the certificate of appropriateness. And then for certificate of appropriateness, it says right here, review criteria and considering an application for certificate of appropriateness, the commission or HPO shall review it for compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties and any applicable design guidelines previously ratified by the City Council. So you're pulling in those standards and guidelines in the review criteria. So when they come to you with their application, that's what they have to meet. So there's not really a need to even cross-reference like the SOI definitions or the guidelines definitions, because that jargon's not being used in this ordinance.
Okay.
Okay. I guess I was coming at it at the same angle. I think Member Davenport was that without those other documents, it's hard to say how, we're trying to make it clear minus those documents. And I think those documents are what will make this clear. And so we're kind of working at it a little bit backwards. With space, those documents that will be forthcoming, the guidelines would have that information to make it clear to the public, the applicant, the homeowner of, what the process is. So I would go with staff recommendations to what needs to be eliminated. Does it need to be in this ordinance itself, with the recommendation that those things that are eliminated are somehow
well, Mike, I think we're talking a little bit in kind of a nebulous thing. I think if we just go through each definition, you'll kind of understand a little bit more what we're saying. And you can then have input on whether it really needs to be a definition or not. And if it does, then, that's within the committee's recommendation purview.
Okay, I'd say go for it.
Okay. So starting with the addition, I would say that the term addition is really included in alteration, and it doesn't really need to be defined. Addition is a kind of defined in context. So that's staff recommendation on addition. Discussion.
Sure. I guess, well, so, let's see. Some of these comments came from other ordinances that I had read, where I think maybe what those ordinances were trying to do were meet building permit definitions, perhaps. So, and maybe this is something that'll come out in the wash when you compare this to other programs within the city and how this compares and contrasts. So if somebody puts in for a building permit for an addition, is that different than a an alteration permit? Is that different from a new construction? So we don't have to deal with that right now, but anyway. I agree that it's a word for, or it's a component of alteration, definitely.
Well, and it's not really used in the ordinance to trigger any sort of requirement or anything. The term alteration is.
Okay.
And that's why I recommend.
Oh, so
yeah.
that's what you're saying, that
Yeah.
So alteration is in current code.
Well, alteration is what triggers the certificate of appropriateness. Addition doesn't. Does that make sense? So.
Oh, okay, in this
Yeah.
code, not
Yeah.
other city code.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. So eliminate.
And I think too, Mr. Mays, this might be something you could speak to. Just because something's historic doesn't alter whether people need to get permits for certain types of work on their homes. I mean, I can go and replace a kitchen faucet, and, well, I hope I don't need a permit for that. However, if I'm going to replace the trim on the outside of the home, I may need a permit for that. Is there a definition within the city code as to what does require a building permit?
Yeah, the code spells out those improvements that do require permits and those that don't.
So again, the point I'm trying to get to is what triggers something to go before the commission for review is whether they've requested a permit. And the city already defines when you need a permit. So there isn't a need within this ordinance to define those things. It's just when a permit is requested on a property within the historic district, that then triggers the review process.
Can I ask though, aren't there some projects on historic homes that would trigger a permit that a home that's not in historic district wouldn't? That was my only concern with eliminating that.
Sorry, what's the question?
So is there items that that were done on historic property that would trigger a certificate of appropriateness, or that a normal house that's not in a historic district, it wouldn't trigger that?
Well,
When you're defining what requires a permit or not, won't there be a difference between a historic home versus one not historic?
Well, and I guess part of the trigger is how the community regulates those improvements. How we regulate those is through any necessary permits with the city. And
So if we had a new permit with historic guidelines attached to it, would that be a different definition than what's in the building code now?
no, they still require a building permit. So they would just have to get a certificate of appropriateness as well. And what triggers that is an alteration. So that's why, these definitions are referring to terms used in the ordinance. So if the term is not used in the ordinance in a way that's significant, there's no need to define it. The term addition is not used to trigger any sort of requirement or anything. The term alteration is. So that's why addition, now you would use the term addition and alteration, so maybe you want to clarify what addition is for purposes of alteration. But again, that's just, and then this is just staff recommendation. I think it's clear from the context what an addition is, but if the committee feels it'd be more clear to define addition, then they can. But alteration is really the main term here. And there's already requirements in the building code that require a building permit. So if it's an addition under needing a building permit, then it's an alteration needing a certificate of appropriateness triggering this review. Does that make sense?
I totally get you now, finally. Took
Okay.
like forever, but no, I get it. So I think what, it totally makes sense to scratch it from this definition or whatever. And I would, though, add a clarification under alteration that could include addition. So, got it.
Yeah.
Next. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Adversely affect, when used throughout this ordinance, adversely affect is used to talk about the adverse effect to the homeowner rather than the property. So I would just make sure that adversely affect, if you're going to define that, and again, I don't necessarily, that doesn't need to be defined, because I think that one's kind of clear from the context, but you should define it as to, because here it's used, the applicant or any persons adversely affected by the action of the commission may appeal the decision to the city council. So you would just want to define it in that context.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, it is used also in some additions that you made. So you'll just have to, again, clarify. But again, that's something I don't think really needs to be defined. I think adverse effect, is sort of kind of obvious. It's just a negative impact. So
It is, this is getting kind of weedy, but it is, it's a term used in Section 106. But it doesn't have to be in here because Section 106 covers it. So, okay. So, next one.
And the committee just may want to review the term alteration, how it's defined. I think it's well defined here. You may want to review and just make sure everybody is comfortable with this definition.
So I highlighted the yellow, the changing of paint color, for either discussion or scratching it out. I think what it should say is changing of historic paint color. That is, or paint color that's historically significant. So, but that could be identified in the guidelines. And it doesn't have to be here. So the next one, or unless anyone has any comments, please chime in.
So we're striking the changing of paint color. I think it's a good idea because I think it's going to be a red flag to people, and we can't paint our houses whatever color we want, etc. So having it in the guidelines for specific buildings where it's important, then great. But in here, I wouldn't have it in there.
I think it belongs in the guidelines. Like you said, dependent on the property that's associated with. So the next one's appropriateness.
Yes, staff is at the committee's pleasure with this definition. It was also a defined term in the 2000 ordinance.
Any comments? So building.
Building, I don't think the term building is necessary to define.
And the reason, in the parentheses for purpose of designation, that applies to the National Register standards for designation of historic landmarks or historic properties and landmarks.
Okay.
That's what that means. But it's covered under that guidance, so.
Yeah, so
Building official?
we've already discussed building official.
Got it.
Certified local government program. Again, that's not necessary to define for purposes of the ordinance. but at the committee's pleasure, it doesn't hurt anything.
Well, if I may just kind of mention again, Chairperson Davenport, that every time you put a definition here and it is changed by another entity, then making sure that we always have the most up-to-date definitions within our code. We don't want to confuse our customers and residents when it can be by reference, or if it can be in the guidelines, which can be more easily updated, as opposed into code, which will require text amendments to update. That's always easier to manage the code in that respect. I think as an example, as we've been looking through the code on other matters, Ms. Walker and I will find over time we've put multiple definitions that are slightly different in different sections of the code. And so that just makes it harder when you need to update that to make sure they are consistent.
I guess that totally makes sense. And I guess maybe I'll just skip ahead a little bit in that what we're doing now by going through these definitions and maybe elsewhere here, and that was on page 59 of our packet, under the powers, duties, and responsibilities of the commission. There's Section A, establish such rules and procedures as are necessary for the efficient conduct of the business of the commission. And I had a comment in here that we can change, or that's one of the recommended powers or duties of changing things within the code, correct? Or not? Code amendments, such as what you just said, I guess. If a definition were to change, let's say, and we decided to keep these definitions here, we could decide to update the definitions here or elsewhere, wherever they live.
So you're saying where's the power to make those changes? Who has the power? Because anything within the city's code will be obviously subject to the council's approval of any text amendment.
Right. So I think we'll get to that, I guess, because I suggested that we establish the rules, but I guess we recommend the rules that are therefore established by city council.
Well, each committee and commission establishes their own rules that's adopted at the committee and commission level. So that's kind of a separate document. I think as you're evaluating each of these components, it's going to, part of the determination is where does it best live, so that it gives clear guidance, it requires minimal maintenance and constant update, and is easy to understand and can be communicated to the public. So, definitions, provisions, guidelines, it may be appropriate in the commission bylaws, or it may be appropriate in the design guidelines, or it may be appropriate in informational material that's provided to the customer so that they better understand their obligations.
So I think this definition would be great for the guidelines, because really the ordinance, again, is that foundational source of authority and requirements on the public. And when the public goes to then, okay, this requires the public to take these certain steps when they want to make an alteration to their property, then that they are referred to the guidelines. And at that point, you can provide sort of that overview of what a certified local government program is, and and provide all that, more in the guidelines. The ordinances aren't really a place to go to for information. They're a source of authority.
That's fine. I said earlier, it doesn't matter to me where they live as long as they are available.
Yeah,
So
okay.
that's cool.
Okay. And then certificate of appropriateness, I think that is appropriate to define. So at the committee's pleasure on discussion of that definition, and I believe it is sufficient, but welcome the committee's input.
I think that's fine.
Certificate of completion, that doesn't necessarily need to be defined. I mean, that's something that's issued, I think, with any approved construction project, correct, Michael?
Correct.
Okay.
Their certificate of economic hardship, I think, should be defined. Staff recommends should be defined, so.
Makes sense.
Character defining feature, that's. That's really at the committee's pleasure. This it is referred to in the requirement on their certificate of appropriateness. It says, nor shall any person make any material change to the character defining features of the property. So that is something that the public may look at and need more clarification on. So that's at the committee's discussion.
I think it would be fine in the guidelines. Anybody else?
I agree.
Okay. Community planning department, that can be defined. It is, kind of referenced throughout the, we'll just have to be, again, because I can just check to make sure we're consistent among our ordinances with how we're referring to community development. Contributing property or resource, I'd recommend including that definition.
Construction, the one before that.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Construction, I think is plain meaning.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think that needs to be defined.
Thank you. Demolition.
Demolition, I think, is probably a term that should be defined, especially given that if there's any sort of dispute as to whether a demolition permit or a certificate of appropriateness for demolition is required, even though demolition is a pretty commonplace term, it may be helpful, I think, legally speaking. So I welcome the committee's input on and critique of this definition.
I think it should stay because there's a whole section on demolition. So I guess I was wondering though, the next one, demolition by neglect, is that too weak? Is that too specific, or?
I appreciate that definition personally, but welcome the committee's discussion and input.
I think it's very important to have it in there.
I say keep it. Or it could be a sub definition of demolition. I don't know if that would help or confuse the issue. Doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, you can either include it, you can say demolition, any act or process, blah, 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 such term includes an act or omission that destroys or contributes to the destruction of a building, known as demolition by neglect. So yeah, it can be either way.
Okay.
Design guidelines, I would recommend defining. Designated historic property, I'd recommend defining. Exterior, I don't think needs to be defined. it was defined in the 2000 or exterior design element was a definition in the 2000 ordinance.
Okay.
Facade also, I don't think that needs to be defined.
Okay.
Historic district should be defined.
Okay.
Historic preservation easement, I don't know, or historic easement, I don't know that that is really discussed in this ordinance at all. So it doesn't need to be a defined term because, and I definitely understand the need for historic easements and covenants, but those are not terms that are even used in the ordinance.
Yeah, okay.
So.
Agreed.
A historic property or resource, I believe the only thing that's designated under this ordinance are districts and landmarks, I'm pretty sure. To look. And if so, I would recommend that just district and landmark be defined. And the term landmark can be defined to include site, building, object. But I need to double check that.
And Madam Chair, I don't want to guess for you, but I think what you may be getting at there is within the district, or one of the defining characteristics of the district, are the master plan elements that were built when the city was first started. Is that what you were looking at? So we look at things like the plazas, the walkways, the way the streets are laid out.
Meaning, or are you talking about the historic property or resource definition here?
Yes.
That is a general term for, well, it says it right there, for building structures, historic district objects. So those are pretty much defined by the National Register. It's another word for, well, I'll have to look at the National Register criteria, whether they call them historic properties or resources, but it's a overall term for anything that can be nominated to the National Register or is eligible for listing to the National Register.
Well, and again, the way I look at it, and again, I don't mean to guess at what your meaning might be, is that the overall design of the town, so it's not the individual houses, it's not the individual buildings, but one of the things that makes our historic district unique and eligible for being included on the National Register is the fact that this was a master plan community, and the layout, so it's the overall layout is also one of those resources. And if that's not included in the nomination, I would certainly look to see the nomination to be updated to expressly include that.
Yes, that should happen. And it has been recommended. And that is covered under the National Register nomination form, or it should be. The nomination form should address individual structures, buildings, features, objects maybe, but also overall, the overall characteristics of the landscape around each building, the street, the neighborhood, the section, you kind of work your way out to the boundary of the historic district, and figure out what's contributing to not only the building but the district as a whole.
Well, and again, I think we're probably not talking about the same thing. What I'm talking about is the fact that when Hoover Dam construction was anticipated, was planned, and Boulder City was also planned. In other words, they said, we're gonna build a dam and we're gonna build a town, and here's what the dam's gonna look like, and here's what the town's gonna look like. So it wasn't just the buildings that were to be built in the town, it was the way the town was to be built. The master planning of the town, I believe, is something that fits in with the uniqueness of this community, because that was done in very few other places by the federal government. So I think your definition here includes that. And once again, if that's not part of the nomination form, if it was just assumed that, well, that's the way the town was built, I think it's a unique factor that needs to be pointed out and preserved so that we don't lose that structure.
I agree. And it has been recommended that we emphasize that more so.
But again, I think your change here encompasses that idea within that nomination.
Mm-hmm.
Well, currently, the only thing this ordinance contemplates designating are historic districts or landmarks. So really, the term that needs to be defined is district and landmark. So how this says historic property or resource, I would recommend this being historic landmark and historic district, those two being the defined terms.
And yes, go ahead.
You can include the term resource within the definition of historic landmark, but that's the term.
Right. And the inclusion of the word landscape, I don't know that that was part of the master plan, or whether that just came later. And just as with paint colors and things like that, I don't know that we've ever had something defined as what the landscape is. I don't recall seeing that in the nomination, that there were specific things. I know there's discussion about green lawns and things like that, but I don't know that that was ever specifically a contributing factor in the nomination form.
So landscape in the context of vegetation was not
And that's my
individually.
concern about adding it now, especially within our desert
I don't
environment.
think she's talking about landscapes. I thought she was talking about landmarks.
It says here, one of the changes that you have, I'm looking at page 53, it says landscape.
Oh, okay. So, again, this is a general term that's from the National Register nomination information. So this applies to any and every historic property in the United States, which can include landscapes.
Yes, and I have seen that in some historic districts. Hedges, for instance, I've seen that included as one of the factors, but I don't know that within the Boulder City Historic District that particular types of landscape were ever defined.
So landscapes can be greenery,
Well, I understand
it can also
that.
be
I understand that. but
streets and lights and, you know, I don't understand. It doesn't, this is just really general, and I don't think it needs to be in here. You're suggesting that we have landmarks and historic districts defined.
Yes,
But
so
my-
whatever you want to have be designated, it needs to fit within either the district definition or landmark definition, because when you go later on in the ordinance, those are the only types of enumerated historic resources. It's either district or landmark. Now, in our current ordinance, we also have historic areas, so you could also add area. That's within the committee's discretion. But I'm just saying that however you want to describe it, if you want to include landscapes within the definition of historic landmarks so that landscapes can be designated, that's within the committee's purview. I'm just saying that for ordinance purposes, the actual term shouldn't be historic property or resource, it should be historic landmark.
Got it. And so cultural landscapes or landscapes can be identified in the guidelines, whether they're in the current Historic District National Register nomination form or not.
I've offered my opinion on the inclusion of that particular word here. But again, it's up to the committee for discussion
I'm sorry, I missed what your recommendation was, to remove it or to keep it?
to remove it.
but we're removing this anyway, I think. No? You want historic property and resources you wanted to keep or suggest?
I think it should.
I thought you were replacing that with landmark and historic district.
Historic landmark is not defined. I'm saying that you
Landmark is.
Oh,
It's-
is it later?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see that.
Landmark as well as historic district are defined.
Okay, yeah, whichever, we either remove that, or we change it to historic landmark and, get rid of landmark, however the committee wants to do it. I was just saying that historic building or resource is just not, used. It's either historic,
And I agree. So it should just be removed with or without the landscape. And the landscape can be addressed in the guidelines if we're going to address landscape features.
yeah, and so I guess the question is, should the landscape itself be a type of resource that can be historically designated, or is landscape included just in the features of another type of property? But that's within the committee's discussion.
I think that's addressed when we revise the guidelines.
Okay.
So I have a hypothetical question for just having the definitions in historic district or landmark. So if there's a property that's outside the current historic district, and it's a standalone, it doesn't have anything around it that would constitute it being in a district, we could designate it as a landmark, even though it's a building, correct, under this standard?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Historic preservation. That's up to the committee. It doesn't necessarily need to be defined, but it's up to the committee.
I'm comfortable with putting that in the guidelines. Although it was originally in the Shippo's
Oh, it is?
model.
Okay, then yeah, we can, yeah.
As well as historic property, I believe was in the one above it.
Yeah,
Was in
I
the-
disagree with that one. Because you don't, it's either historic landmark or a historic district. I mean, historic property isn't, isn't a term used throughout. I mean, it should really.
I believe there is a reference to historic property as far as certain qualifications, like that it be 50 years old, and so I think that does come into play in some of the other verbiage later on in the ordinance.
Let's see.
Especially if you're looking to, as Member Folda had mentioned, if you wanted to nominate something else that's not currently included, I think that's where that term comes into play.
No, that's the term for a historic landmark. That's when, because the term landmark includes all properties, buildings, and things like that. But the term historic property is used. The term historic property is used, so historic property should also could also be defined. But I would just say, for purposes of the ordinance, the only consequential term is landmark and district. Historic property is discussed more in the demolition sections, and even then I might want to call it, because I think that's referring to both landmarks and district. And
Can I
Yeah.
clarify? I think the difference is historic property and/or resource is just a general term for a cultural resource. The landmark and the historic district are designated, meaning we have gone through the process to identify the historic property, let's say a building. We feel that it's significant somehow, and it requires preservation. Therefore, we designate, and we've added it to our list, whether that's at the local, state, or national level, and we want to preserve it. So it's officially designated.
Yes, that's correct.
So
The landmark or district, yeah.
right.
Yep. So the term historic property is kind of just used, I think, more generally to refer to any historically designated, whether it's within a historic property within a district, or it's a historic land designated as an historic landmark. So it's both. Historic property is historic property located within a historic district, or it is a historic
A
landmark.
historic property can be not designated.
Well, I
Perhaps
think
it just hasn't been identified yet, and
Well,
and
the
there's
term-
no guidance for how to preserve or protect it. Is that my interpretation?
Well, the term, and I understand what you're saying, and I agree with that. What I'm saying is for purposes of the ordinance, it says here, okay, no, I see what you're saying now, yes. Yes, I think that's accurate. So it can or cannot be, it can be defined if you'd like, but I don't think it has to be, because I think the consequential definitions are district and landmark. But the landmark and historic property should be defined as you just described. It can be something not designated. Yeah.
Any comments or questions about that? Or should we move on?
I think it should stay in. I do think, as I said, when you read through the others, and as already been mentioned by yourself and Member Fulda, that it's a reference to something you may do in the future, that you're going to give that designation or determine that designation later on. So I think it's important to keep in, as well as the historic preservation next and the preservation professional.
So the historic preservation professional, is that the term we want to use? Or is officer more appropriate?
You know, the hesitation, I guess, or the difficulty in giving a name to that is it's probably going to change. So it may be an individual consultant, it may be an expert in some particular area. So I'm not sure what would be, historic preservation asset. I don't know. Mr. Mays, do you have a suggestion?
Well, I go back to building official. So building officials defined in NRS, is defined in our code. But how local jurisdictions fulfill those responsibilities is up to the council to decide. That's a policy decision. So, for example, in Boulder City, we've had both a full-time building official or we've contracted out. So I think it's similarly with a historic, if we were to stick with the official designation here, it's a common term that people know, but how the local jurisdiction implements that is up to the local jurisdiction to decide.
Mr. Mays, is there anything within the CLG status that you might be aware of that maybe gives some definition to that? Again, my hesitation about using the HPO term is because it is very common, as you said, it's well known. is it somewhere in the CLG that says that's a requirement of the CLG or not?
Not a requirement to have a historic preservation official, but to have staff that supports those functions in some capacity, whether it's utilization of third party or in-house.
All right. So I'm still not sure.
And I'm hesitant to use officer because in the preservation world at the national and state level, those are positions that live and or are managed by the State Historic Preservation Office. In fact, they're called the State Historic Preservation Officer, and they designate officers in other jurisdictions, deputy officers, or that's what Las Vegas has. And that is and therefore so this is something I think it would be handy to have the Shippo's input on, so that we don't confuse what they may think of an officer is. Because I believe that a historic preservation officer within a municipality, it's through an agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office. They're basically taking on Shippo duties at a local level so that they don't have to go to the Shippo for every consultation effort, is my understanding. So would officer confuse the Shippo? I don't know. Would a local Shippo or a local historic preservation officer, as defined here, be confusing or not? I don't know.
Well, let me follow up with Shippo for clarification on that one.
Improvement, I don't think needs to be defined, but it's up to the committee's discussion.
I agree.
Integrity, I defer to the committee.
I think that can be identified in the guidelines.
Inventory, I don't think needs to be defined. I think that's usually when referred to in the ordinances, it's clear from the context that that means the list of historic properties.
Okay. Agreed.
Landmark, and this is what was causing all the confusion for me. I was just saying that the historic landmark really needed to be defined, and it wasn't. The term historic property was, but landmark wasn't. So, I appreciate the committee's indulgence with that confusion, and appreciate this definition. National Register of Historic Places, I think, doesn't need to be defined, but it can be up to the committee.
I think it can live in the guidelines.
Yeah, and again, I think it gets back to the discussion we had early on that it's a known entity, and so simply by referring to it should be sufficient without having to further define it.
Non-contributing property, I think, is helpful to define. Object, I defer to the committee on that, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be if it's defined elsewhere, like in the guidelines or SOI. again, these preservation, reconstruction, rehabilitation, relocation, renovation, I don't think these terms need to be defined. Restoration, maintenance and repair definitely needs to be defined, but I don't think that these other terms do, but I defer to the committee discussion on that. That's just staff recommendation.
And Madam Chair, those are from the SOI standards, right? I mean, these definitions are from that. So again, I would agree with staff that since we say that it needs to comply with the SOI standards, that these are in the standards.
Okay. Oh, you got it right there?
Routine maintenance, we can add or ordinary. Routine maintenance, you could say routine or ordinary maintenance or repair. Or we can, whichever term we use, or we can just make sure we use the same term throughout. Well, I do think that should be defined for this.
Oh, okay.
Because, people need to understand and know when the certificate of appropriateness is triggered versus when it's just ordinary maintenance. So if it's not ordinary maintenance, that's specifically carved out. So we do need a description of what that is.
And Madam Chair, I think that later on or towards the end of this, when it gets to enforcement, that is a factor in that. So I would agree, and I would prefer the term ordinary rather than routine.
In the Park Service, we use routine, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm just, one routine might be different for others rather than saying ordinary maintenance.
And under 1127.7.7D, it does say ordinary maintenance
Okay.
under that. And it kind of goes into a little bit, but I would really like it if we don't define it and give examples in this that we do and that the design standards do, to make it really clear what the difference between that and something else is.
Okay.
The SOI standards, I think, that's up to the committee. Those can be defined.
I'm inclined to keep it. Or, well, if we're getting rid of National Register.
I think that is helpful to keep that defined. It was also
We did?
defined.
Okay.
I think it's helpful to have it defined, and also the 2000 ordinance did include it as well.
Okay.
And we can can say like as amended from time to time or something like that to make it clear is whatever's most current. Setback I don't think needs to be defined because that's probably defined elsewhere in the code. Setting, I don't think that needs, staff would recommend removing that definition. Let me see. Significant characteristics of the property, that's not a term that's used in the ordinance. So I would recommend deleting. Site. So site is not currently contemplated as a designation. Again, it's either district or a landmark. But if the committee wants to also add site, they can also do that.
I think we need to keep it landmark or district as our primary designation. But just so folks know, all of these for the purpose of designation generally applies to National Register designation, or that's where that comes from.
Madam Chair, would that, would the landmark encompass that? In other words, if you had a particular site, that could be determined to be a landmark?
The term site is included within the definition of landmark.
Yep.
Right.
So it's, at the local level, it appears that landmark is just kind of lumping the National Register specific designations as defined here.
Right, so it's landmark is an inclusive term that contains these definitions already?
Yep.
Okay.
So, and if the committee finds it helpful to define site for the public so that if a site is designated as a landmark, then the committee can keep the definition, or, you know, if it's already kind of defined in other places, doesn't have to be defined in the ordinance.
Well, I think that would come along when you considered the designation. You would, you know, that would be part of that consideration. And it's already included in the term landmark.
Right.
All right, stabilization, same recommendation as above for renovation, et cetera. Street accessories is not used elsewhere in the ordinance, so I'd recommend removal. Structure, again, staff recommends removing that definition. Survey, staff would recommend removing the term survey. It's not used very often, and it's pretty clear from the context when it is used what it's referring to. And finally, workmanship, defer to the committee. That is used. That is not really used within the ordinance, so.
It kind of comes from the Secretary of Interior standards, so we can put it in the guidelines.
Okay. That's it.
Any more comments on the definitions, or should we move to the purpose statement? So let's move to the purpose statement. I believe, Tracy, you had a comment about that?
I did. So, and I think Member Turner had the same comment in his comments, that there was a couple of aspects of the 2000 code that I liked to include for the purpose, and we can debate that out or whatever, but I think, you know, education needs to be part of this. So, referring to the 2000 historic ordinance right now, it says, raise public awareness of the benefits of historic preservation to encourage civic pride in Boulder City's history. So that was one. And then the second one, provide a mechanism for identifying and preserving the historic and architectural resources of the city. And the third one, assist property owners in the preservation and restoration of historic properties. So I just kind of want to emphasize a little bit more that it's not just to make everyone's life miserable and regulated, but to preserve our history and have pride in our city, and to assist those property owners in doing so. So those are just we could add those as G, H, and I, if everyone agrees, or they were slightly different than what was in there, so I just thought it would be more of a positive to the purpose, but the committee can kind of weigh in on that.
I'm, excuse me, fine with maybe making them G, H, and I, but I wonder if some of that is duplicative of A through F. Or, and I haven't looked to see.
Yeah, so it does have civic pride under B.
Yeah.
So maybe if we could just alter that one a little bit to kind of expound on it. I just felt like the wording was less robotic and more encouraging, I guess, in its tone, is how I felt.
Do you want to take a stab at redoing the purpose and incorporating the 2000 ordinance? I'm fine with adding G, H, and I just don't want to be duplicative of A through F, so. Or making A through F more positive. You or Ray want to revise that purpose statement?
Yeah, I just didn't have a good way of incorporating it. I'm not a very good writer at that, but I did like the purpose of the 2000, except for the portion B of it, because it doesn't speak, this one, it eliminates designating any properties, which I don't think that's the intent. So just the port of A, if there's a way to kind of change the language a little bit to add it in, not duplicate it, I guess, but just really more tweak it just a little bit. Any thoughts? I just did the easy way of just going GHI. But we can rewrite maybe B, or just kind of expound on some of those, or maybe staff could help us with that.
Yeah, let's just do that. Let's just
I'm going
add.
to work on incorporating A of the 2000 ordinance into the purpose statement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So moving on to Section 3, Historic Preservation Commission.
Madam Chair, my apologies, but I'm going to have to take my leave. I have another commitment, but
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you for your help tonight. One of the things I wanted to let y'all know is that, well, it's not here, I don't think, sorry. Never mind, when we get to it. Any comments about, well, so I guess my question is about the CLG and are footnotes added or not to codes?
No, they're not typically footnotes in ordinances.
Okay. So it's,
Go
ahead. I wasn't sure, this is where your help would be super helpful to determine, when do we have to cite what it says in the CLG, or do we not?
You don't.
Okay.
There's no need to cite.
Okay.
Yeah. I would recommend a set number of Historic Preservation Commission members. And I think that if we do allow additional members, if that's not a limit, we would have to run that by Shippo, because I don't know. Typically, like a commission like this, because this is a body with authority, a significant authority, you would want to have a set number and have that more set in stone because of the just the authority of the committee and the public need to know who's a commission member and how many commission members, and not that you can't expand it later, but usually an ordinance amendment is better because then you have terms of how those members, additional members are appointed, et cetera. It's just, and it's always, you have to have an odd number, so it's just better to have a set number as staff's recommend.
That sounds good to me.
I just had other question on the membership because with the review and things that need to happen, is there any timeline constraint that would require them to meet more often than once a month, in staff's opinion, where we might need more members in case there was an issue with having a quorum? Or is this permit process slow enough that they can wait to the next meeting and just continue with having one meeting a month?
Well, part of the research I've been doing to just get an understanding of the potential number of permits that may come before the commission, I had asked staff to poll for the last fiscal year how many permits were issued within the historic district, and it was approximately 50. So I think ultimately to answer that question, it will be dependent upon the scope of what is going to require the certificate of appropriateness to make the determination as to how many permits will be reviewed by the commission. So there is always a possibility the commission may be required to meet more than once a month, depending on that.
Do we just say at least once a month? Well, just what it said, well, no, it doesn't say that.
Michael, in comparison, do you know how many permits the planning commission reviews in a year?
On average, the planning commission has really 1 to 3 applications each month.
Huh.
But of course, they're not reviewing all building permits. It's only those projects that require either some type of relief or rezoning or some other type of zoning consideration. If it meets all of the code requirements, it doesn't require going to the planning commission.
So maybe we leave the,
Well, that's really a threshold issue because with this ordinance, there's built in an administrative review of their certificate of appropriateness by the historic preservation officer for those the people that are applying for things that are obviously comply and just are more routine. There's kind of an administrative level review. You do have it struck in this model ordinance, and it's certainly within the committee's purview to recommend that all certificate of appropriatenesses go through the commission. But you can have an administrative level review where just like not all building permits go to the planning commission. A routine certificate of appropriateness could just be approved by the historic preservation officer. The way it's contemplated here, the officer and I think the chair of the commission meet, so that the commission does have that sort of liaison input. And where the chair thinks this needs to go before the full commission, it can go. But that's a question on whether you want an administrative layer of review or no. On how often the committee should meet or commission should meet.
maybe we just don't state how often we have to meet. It's not necessary. It's dependent on the workload.
That's usually established in the bylaws anyway.
Oh, got it.
To answer your question more directly, Councilwoman Folda, I think that we'll be able to schedule meetings as necessary, and there won't be really a need for additional members to achieve a quorum. I think 5 should be sufficient. Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would agree that 5 would be appropriate.
Thank you. And I would agree that, if we had design guidelines set that are very clear, then a lot of that, if they very clearly comply with those guidelines, and administratively, I think a lot of things could happen that way. It's when they are not complying that it would need, I think, a further process. But I'll let the rest of the committee weigh in on that.
I agree with that.
I do too. Thanks. So any other comments regarding this section?
I would just say that staff can explore the initial appointments and whether we can just convert the existing Historic Preservation Committee into the commission
Okay.
rather than reappointing, but staff will just have to explore that.
Okay. So the next.
And I think
Sorry.
for the term of service, couldn't you do a 3-2 kind of term of alternating the current members instead of having to break it down from 2-2-1 as it's written?
Yeah, you don't have to be this specific. It's this specific normally when you're creating like a new commission. Yeah, I think you're right. You can just say staggered terms. We don't have to. I can work on this section, and when we bring the draft ordinance back, we can discuss it further.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next section 4, organization, officers, rules, and meetings. I think my question was, does it need to be specified who keeps the minutes and records? Is it the commission truly, or is it staff, or?
It doesn't have to be specified. The again, the commission being an entity of the city's already required to do these things.
Okay.
So it doesn't need to be specified.
Okay.
And the city would be the record keeper.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any comments about that section? Okay. Section 5, powers, duties, and responsibilities of the commission. And I guess my comment was, is A, okay, as is? So I guess my question is rules of procedures, if those should change, does this ordinance have to change, or do we just need to change our bylaws?
Yeah, if it's codified, if it's in the code, and you're deviating from what the code says, then it would require a text amendment. So that's where, if some of these regulations can live somewhere else, like the rules of procedure, the bylaws, which are reviewed by the commission and amended by the commission, then that's easier to manage than having to go through the text amendment process.
So do we need to say something like establish such rules and procedures as, i.e. the bylaws, commission bylaws? I don't know.
I think that you can. I think it's fine to include that. Yeah, I think that makes sense to include that. The only thing I would say is I think conduct, so in the model ordinance, the very top one is your second one here, where it says adopt methods and procedures necessary to survey local historic properties within the boundaries of the district. The model ordinance says that it is to conduct a survey of local historic properties. So I would just recommend that you go with the model ordinance rather than the kind of the first one you have, but as far as, or I'm sorry, rather than adopt methods and procedures necessary to survey local historic properties. But then the second one, establish rules and procedures, I think that is a clarifying thing in the ordinance that clarifies your ability to adopt these rules and procedures to govern your operations.
I'm sorry, so B, adopt methods and procedures necessary to survey local properties within the boundaries of the city. Does the model say something different?
Yeah.
And it says, I'm sorry, what it is?
Yes. No, sorry. Well, I think just first off, I want to just, I guess, settle your proposed addition of established rules and procedures as are necessary for the efficient conduct of business. I think staff would recommend the committee adopting this change. So that's staff recommendation for that, number one. Number two, I was just pointing out that when you had made these changes, it appeared that it was inadvertently the original A in the Shippo model ordinance was inadvertently deleted, and if you look at the Shippo model ordinance, the very first A is conduct a survey of local historic properties.
Yeah, okay.
And I see that you have addressed that in your B, but your B is different than the model ordinance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I don't know why I changed it to adopt methods and procedures for surveying rather than conducting. Well, I guess this is a question for you. We might not necessarily actually do the survey.
Yeah, but that's implied in conduct a survey. It doesn't mean it's not literal.
Okay.
It's not meant to be taken literally. But you as the historic, you as the commission, staff would present this, survey to you, and you would, have, you would direct that survey, in other words. So that's what that means.
Okay. I'm fine either going with what was originally written in the model code, the original A, I guess. Which probably makes sense because, well, I guess we should look at the CLG. Did the CLG say something different?
It said the A was required.
I know, but what did it actually say? Like, I mean, I wonder if we need to look at the CLG manual or agreement to say, does it say something more specific, or I don't know.
Well, Shippo did draft this in accordance with CLG, so I mean.
Okay, then we'll
Yeah,
just.
that was their guidance to have, these were
Okay.
the required provisions to contain within the ordinance.
Okay. So let's just go with what was in the model code.
Mm-hmm.
So C, the inventory. And, well, all of the next ones. I mean, does anybody have any comments or? Tracy, did you have any additions or comments?
So this is under 1127.6, right? We're moving on to that one.
1127-5, powers and duties.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I had no changes on that or recommendations.
This is a staff recommendation. I do have a couple of comments.
Okay,
Just regulate new construction. I do think that that's, I just think the wording, if you'd be comfortable with me kind of looking at that a little bit closer on the wording, just because regulate new construction, I mean, obviously, it would require the certificate of appropriateness, so it would go before you, but that term kind of implies something more broad, so I would just want to just look at that a little bit closer.
I'll just wait to see what you come up with, because I'm sure there's a legal definition for regulation versus recommendation versus,
Right, yeah, so I just wanted to just kind of give the committee, I guess, just let you know that I just wanted to look at that wording, that's all.
okay. Does this code regulate overall?
I wouldn't use the term I mean, yes, I mean, this code does, because it's requiring the certificate of appropriateness for all new construction within the area. But as far as like additional building permits and other things that they're required to do, like safety-wise and things like that, like, no, you're just looking at the SOI standards, right? So that's what I just want to make sure we're, because that's the scope. It's not like safety and other things that, so I just want to make sure we're being within the scope.
Yep,
So, yeah.
makes sense.
And then I kind of wanted to also look at the regulation of signs for the same reasons. I'm not saying that shouldn't be within the committee's purview or the commission's purview. I just want to take a little bit more of a look at that. Because signs are also very First Amendment sensitive, and they're also regulated by different aspects of Title 11. So that the planning department would already be reviewing for. So I don't know if it's necessary, but so I just want to look at that a little bit further and just kind of see if it is something that the commission should provide input on. As far as of course we want to make sure that they're not impeding the historic character of the property or district, but at the same time, there's a lot of First Amendment regulation. The government's limited on how we can regulate signs. So
This is for permanent signs. Are permanent signs a First Amendment right? Or are you talking about?
speech is a First Amendment right, and the Supreme Court has broadly interpreted that for signs.
To include a store sign?
People can,
Wow.
yeah, you're extremely limited on what local governments can do to regulate signs, especially if they're non-commercial.
If they're, well, yeah, but anyway.
So I just want to look at that a little bit further.
That's the content.
That's a permanent sign, so.
Yeah.
It's not like a temporary placard or protest sign or anything like that, so.
No, I know, but we just have to be, because again, we already do regulate signs in other areas of the code. So just, what's really the commission's purview over that? What's, you know what I mean? I just want to look at that a little bit further.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think her point is when you read this, it could be broadly interpreted
Oh, got it.
regarding the regulation. And so we just need to make sure it's clear.
Oh, you're right. It is pretty broad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's see. Subsection G, you recommend deleting. I think that was included in the model ordinance, so staff doesn't have one opinion or another, but just maybe want to point it out for committee discussion.
Which one?
I'm sorry, not G. The recommend to city manager to
H?
direct staff. Yeah, H,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, no discussion. Moving on, I do have also some concerns with recommending the acquisition of historic easements. Just want to look into that, like not saying one way or the other. Just want to look into that further. And then my last comment would just be, everything else I think is fine. I think the only other comment I would say is the commission doesn't really need to request funds from city council. Again, it's not its own entity. It's already within, any expenditures that the commission recommends making would just be done by city council. So it wouldn't need its own funding. And you all serve, I believe, at you just get reimbursed for your expenses. So I don't believe the commission itself would need funding. Do you have any thoughts, Michael, on that, or agree with that?
Yeah, that's part of the budgetary process that staff works through with the council on an annual basis.
This isn't just for reimbursement for the commission, it's for other purposes of this code. So, but I understand, it's like a given, right?
Exactly, like
We
the
don't- we
commission
can just-
doesn't need funding. Like whatever the commission recommends things funding for, the commission will recommend to city council, hey, we recommend you retain a consultant, or to do this, or whatever. But all that would still, like there's an existing process for that. So the commission doesn't actually need to be appropriated funds. Yeah.
Got it.
That makes
Okay.
sense, yeah.
Any other comments under this section?
Not from staff, no.
Thank you. So section 11-27-6, procedures for landmark or historic district recommendations.
Sorry, I didn't scroll down far enough. I do think the commission should discuss the duties of the HPP.
I'm sorry, which one is that?
Subsection T or U?
Retain consultants and conduct,
No, the next one.
retain a historic preservation professional as deemed necessary by the commission, subject to the prior approval of the city council.
Yes, and it outlines the duties. I think that I really think the existing ordinance already addresses that sufficiently, but I would defer to the committee's discussion on that.
I'm sorry, so you think that elsewhere in the ordinance, these duties are sufficiently outlined?
Yeah, yes. I think.
Well, and also, I think that similar to the evaluation of the commission requesting funds, the commission doesn't hire somebody. The commission doesn't hire the consultant. So that kind of language. I think a lot of what you are addressing here can be covered under preparing and present an annual report on the commission's activities to the city council. That's the way for the commission to communicate needs and future objectives, which then translate into council direction to staff on budgetary and actions for subsequent years.
Are you suggesting we request funds only when we are updating the council? Is that what you just said?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that the council or the commission would provide an annual report to the council on activities and objectives for the future. And that's how a lot of these things can be accomplished. Since the commission in and of itself is not hiring, is not budgeting, is not retaining consultants. It's through that communication to the city council that you accomplish the same goals.
As well as being able to make requests at any time to the council for needs that we may have.
Well, certainly.
For extra funding.
Well, as the budgetary process works, it's an annual process. I mean, certainly if the commission passed a motion saying they would like the council to consider X, that could be taken up with the council as a budgetary amendment. But certainly the best way for the community to operate is to have the annual process with the budget and to plan for the next year and try to minimize any unplanned issues. Now, naturally, something may come up, and that's a conversation between the commission and staff and how that could be communicated back to the council.
That was my question, as far as unforeseen requests, budget requests. Is that covered here?
This, I think, is another example of, does it need to be covered? At any time,
Yeah.
a committee or commission could say, you know, there's this need and we want to pass a motion that communicates that to the city council. It doesn't need to be a responsibility of that commission to do that.
Okay.
Exactly. So yeah, I agree with Michael on that one.
P or?
Well, I kind of skipped over that one, but yes, I agree with Michael on retaining consultants. My numbering's off on mine, so I apologize. I'm talking about the subsection that refers to retaining consultants. Let's see. As in, I agree with Michael on his comments with that. When I initially made a comment, I was discussing the retain a historic preservation professional. I don't think it's necessary to have that section in there. The historic preservation officer, having that defined, which was helpful, and then throughout the ordinance, it discusses what the historic preservation officer's role is, which is reviewing the certificate of appropriateness. I don't necessarily think you have to delineate these duties, especially because, this could be like and again, it also wouldn't be here. It wouldn't be appropriate to put it here because the commission doesn't retain the historic preservation officer. Really, the city does. So if the committee would like to be more clear on what the HPO's duties are, they can, but it wouldn't be under this section. But that's okay. But I don't think it's necessary because I think throughout the ordinance where it discusses historic preservation officer, it clearly delineates what their responsibilities are. Because really, they're just an official, like, they're the same. They have the same duties as the planning department, and the building officials already do. They are just designated this special designation due to their expertise and having that background so that they can sufficiently advise the commission and make decisions on these applications. So it doesn't have to be like a spelled out role, I guess.
Okay. So going back to what Michael was talking about as far as contracting, this was on my page 60, section O section P. That was in the original, the beginning of it was in the original ordinance.
I'm sorry.
Contract with the approval of the council with the county, state, or federal government or agency, which contract is necessary?
Oh, that one's good.
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
have it. I wasn't talking about that one. I was talking about S and T.
S as in Sam?
Yes.
Okay.
Retain consultants. And that was Michael's comment, as in the,
Oh, T, got it.
yeah.
Okay, got it.
Sorry.
That's all right. Again though, S, or sorry, never mind, not S. Okay, got it. It's
Yeah.
redundant. It doesn't necessarily have to be
Yeah.
here. Okay, got it.
Yeah. And same with T. Yeah.
Yep, okay. How about my V through, Y?
See.
I guess with X and right of access, how that would relate to other city employees and representatives of the city. We would just want to look at that.
Okay.
Anything else with that section, 1127.5?
I think W is already addressed elsewhere, but I'll double check that.
Okay. So, next section?
Okay.
11-27-6, procedures for landmark or historic district recommendations. Not a ton of changes in the beginning until you get to section. Yeah, C-4. Yeah. Oh, and this is what I was going to, what I wanted to explain. I highlighted these days, 10 days throughout the document. I think that's just something that will have to be worked out in conjunction with how this relates to other activities in the city that are, concurrent building permits and other reviews by city staff. Tracy, did you have anything in this section?
Okay, in this section, the only questions I had was E and S, which applied to waiver. So I didn't quite understand that portion of it, and it is granted by the council on its own without the input, it looked like, of the committee. So I just wanted to say if that was going to be happen, and without public hearing, that the council be educated on what the designation means and what a waiver means from that. So, but if anyone wants to expound on the waiver and when that would occur, I'd like to hear kind of an explanation of that.
And we can get with Shippo on this. I will say that just by the plain language of the statute or of the ordinance, for one, I would say that council couldn't just do it without a public hearing. It would have to be done in public, number one. Number two, I would say the second sentence says, upon recommendation of the commission, waivers to provisions of this code may be granted by the council. So it does imply a commission review and recommendation prior to the council granting such a waiver. But we can make it more clear that the commission, and I can look elsewhere in the code as to whether you know, if that's within their powers, we might want to say recommend waivers to city council or something if that's not enumerated, which I can't remember off the top of my head whether it is.
This came directly from the model code, so it kind of feels like what I have not looked at the code for the city or for the planning commission, but it sort of seems similar to what the planning commission can do regarding waivers, code waivers.
Well, the provisions have to adhere to NRS, specifically 278. So that's, I think, part of what Ms. Walker's talking about. We would need to review the mechanisms, the public hearing requirements, and how that might work.
Okay.
I will say with staff recommendation on this section, going back up to subsection C6, the proposed additions to the National Register of Historic Places designation. The main purpose of this section is just to clarify that the National Register designation is not a local historic designation. So there's not really a need to add these additional requirements or because the commission already, I think, impliedly has, you know, that ability, but to recommend national designation as well. But I don't know that this has to be kind of spelled out, but I defer to committee discussion. The main point of that section for the purposes of the model ordinance was just to clarify that national designation doesn't qualify you for local, or doesn't automatically make you a locally designated historic resource.
So maybe some more clarification from Shippo on this one, because it feels like you have the procedure to designate something, but then that designation really doesn't mean anything, and you can waive it as well. So, you know, it just kind of it feels like it contradicts itself a little bit. So just maybe a more explanation why they have that set up this way would be appreciated.
I was also confused about why there was this difference between local and national designation. And that's why I thought, well, maybe if you spelled out what's required in the National Register for designation, that is what they're getting at? As far
No, the reason, and I won't speak for Shippo, but the reason is because this is just to outline the procedure for local designation. So I don't really know why the code waivers is in that. I agree with Councilman Fold. I don't know why the code waivers would be in that section, because those really go toward more the certificate of appropriateness rather than the designation.
Yeah.
Unless you're getting that code waiver when you get, at the time you get designated, I'm not sure. But the reason why this just discusses local is because the whole point of the ordinance is to discuss the process for local designation, not national. So the national process is the national process. It doesn't need to be kind of referenced in the ordinance, if that makes sense.
Although the commission will review National Register nominations. We don't necessarily add them to the National Register, but we're part of the process.
Right, yeah,
Okay.
yes, and you can have that input, but the point of this ordinance is to govern the local process, because the local process is what gives the local government then authority to regulate.
Okay.
Because now we have so the national designation doesn't give us, if something's nationally designated, we still have no authority. It has to be locally designated.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
So your suggestion is go back to what it was in the model ordinance?
Yeah,
Okay.
just for that section. And I'll look into the code waiver issue. And we'll talk to Shippo about that.
Got it. Any other comments about that section 6? Go ahead.
I had one other question. So in the 2000 code, it talks about in their designation process. Let me go to it real fast. Sorry. It talks about when it's in the process that no building permits get issued while that is pending. And I just wanted to get committee input of how they felt, or staff, if you have any input as well. Let me read it. It says, once the CRC has issued notice of a public hearing regarding a proposed historic designation, no building permit shall be issued by the city's building department for the affected properties until the CRC has made its recommendation. So I just want to hear any input everyone has on that, if they wanted to apply it to this as well. That would avoid anyone doing some last minute demolition or something like that while things are being considered. In my opinion, that's kind of, I think, why it was there.
Good catch.
I will say the Shippo ordinance says, no person shall carry out any construction, reconstruction, alteration, restoration, rehabilitation, or relocation of any landmark or property within the historic district, nor shall any person make a material change, et cetera, without a certificate of appropriateness. So although it doesn't, I don't know if it has the same requirement for building permits to not be issued, but I will say there is already that prohibition on doing any construction before you get a COA. So
that's for the ones that are already in the historic designation. What about ones proposed?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was missing that nuance. I apologize.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I know it's probably hard to hear me anyway with this thing, but yeah. So this is for if there's a proposed designation being made, that it would stop permit process until that designation is decided or not.
Got it. We'll look into adding that.
So yeah, or just and also obviously for litigation for the city, if that was an issue or not.
Okay.
But I think certainly it was there maybe to protect those properties if there was like a last minute kind of demolition being proposed or something while things are being considered.
Thank you. Anything else in that section?
Staff does not have any comments.
Okay, thank you. So section 11-27-7, certificates of appropriateness for alterations or new construction affecting landmarks or historic districts.
So Chair Davenport, this goes back to the earlier conversation about striking administrative design review affecting landmarks and properties located in the district, and whether having administrative review. So for those building permits that are tied to projects that clearly meet the certificate of appropriateness, is this committee comfortable with having the individual, historic preservation officer or professional, to be able to evaluate and make that determination under the criteria that are set here?
And I will say that this administrative review process does require the HPO to meet with the chair of the commission and review the application and any comments received for consensus. And then if after they meet with the chair, if it's approved, they'll issue the certificate. But if not, I think the HPO can then forward it to the commission if it's not. If the HPO and the chair find that it could have the improvement could have an adverse effect on the landmark or property, then they could forward it to the. Well, actually, they have the authority to even just deny the certificate of appropriateness. But just so you know, the chair is involved as well. It's not just the HPO making this sort of unilateral decision.
So two things, when I looked at this and made comments, I thought I addressed what you were talking about, whether the historic preservation professional can make a determination on certain actions or activities, and an administrative review. And I put in here, so under review criteria under B, when considering the application for certificate of appropriateness, the commission or the historic preservation officer shall review. And I think I put that and or that or in there, and I don't know, is that too nebulous? And the other thing I was a little concerned.
Well, I think what we're referring to is just the striking.
Oh, well, that's,
Yeah.
I struck.
What she's saying is that she's
it
addressed it here, still striking all of
Oh.
this. So
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
I
I'd
think
have to just look at it. a little
So-
bit closer.
So that was where I thought I could cover striking all of that
I see.
and using or.
Okay.
And
I
then
see what
the
you
other
mean.
part was the it still was important to have the commission involved in the process. And I don't think it has to be here in the code. It would be in the instructions on the certificate of appropriateness, I'm thinking, to determine what staff can direct the historic preservation professional to do or not to do, and what the roles of the commission are.
I mean, I think the commission could establish criteria for the HPO and say that if all of the following are met, then the certificate of appropriateness can just be issued without going to the commission.
Yep,
Would
that would work.
Okay. Yeah, that's something.
I just didn't, it just has to have the commission's blessing.
Yeah, yeah.
Without, I don't want to put the burden of the staff to have to make that decision, I guess. I would hope that the staff would seek the commission's recommendation of when to consult with the historic preservation professional.
Oh, no, the HPO would always be involved. The HPO would be the one approving and issuing the certificate. Always.
yes, we would
Right.
want somebody with the expertise that would be reviewing this.
Okay,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's what ties
Which
back
is
to
what
the
I
HPO.
think is currently in here.
Yeah, I just need to read it closer because I
Okay.
just didn't realize that you had addressed it in that manner. So I just will make sure that adequately, because, there might need to be a separate section on administrative just to make it more clear.
Okay,
Especially to the public to know when administrative is going to apply and when the commission review is going to apply.
right.
So I'll take a look at your changes, but.
Okay, thanks.
As long as the overall policy question, just do we have administrative review or not? And the committee consensus appears to be, yes, let's have an administrative review, if it checks all the boxes.
I think I deleted the administrative review, or that administrative review is covered, but it's not under, within my changes, or
Yeah, it's deleted,
comments.
but I think you.
It's deleted, but, yeah.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Any other comments on this section? Tracy?
Yeah, no, I agree that, that's hard to hand over the reins, but I think we don't want to tie up property owners for months on end if they're complying with all the guidelines. And so there needs to be kind of that balance of administratively letting those, as long as there's very well-established guidelines that they can, if those things are checked off the box and then administratively they can be handled, I think that would be fair. And just the ones that aren't complying or have other issues, that they would go before the commission, and I think that would balance out the process. I didn't really read, I was looking at the language so much that I didn't really look into what the process is written, if that makes sense. So if staff has any recommendations to make that smooth and look into that and report back, that would be appreciated. Because I was just more concentrating on the kind of the wording right now and not really the process itself. And I had to back up. Sorry, I did miss something in the previous section. In the previous section under number 6, I think it's 6, item, it's 9. In the case of a historic district designation, written approval of historic designation from no less than 51% of all property owners within the proposed historic district. I just had a question on that because I know a lot of HOAs use that kind of a process now, and they struggle with just getting participation and people voting. So I just want to see if there's any feedback on that of how usually people are, happy with what's being done, but it's the process of getting people involved enough to vote to make it happen. That was the only question I had on that previous one.
Staff has actually recommended deleting all of that entire section. Yeah, all the additional language that was added because, again, that refers to the National Register of Historic Places designation, and the primary purpose of this ordinance is a local designation, so that it's unnecessary to have these guidelines in there.
Okay.
So.
But to clarify, there's I believe, or they're working on it, when it comes to designating property to the National Register, I believe there's federal code that is addressing the need for approval within a historic district. So anyway, but it has nothing to do with this. But however, I should say that our draft historic preservation plan talks about getting buy-in from a majority or not, and I don't remember what it said.
I think that was getting a buy-in if you were going to designate a local historic district.
Right.
Yeah. So this would be all National Register guidelines and processes.
So do we need to add something like that to the local designation as far as what's recommended in the historic preservation plan?
We can look at that and come back with any proposed changes.
Okay.
The only other question I had was on the 90-day provision. So it looks like if there's no action by the city within the 90 days of the application, then the certificate of appropriateness would just be granted. So is that right? If we kind of drop the ball, then they would just automatically receive it?
That is correct.
Okay. So that would just be my only concern, is that if we had someone who was contracted, that there be a way to track those dates and things like that. If there's not someone there full time, that there's a way for those things to continue to be tracked so that, there's a lot of, within this provision, a lot of hearing dates and things like that and calendar periods that need to be followed. And so that was my only concern, if we're doing a contracted historic preservation officer type, that there's a way that staff can still continue to track those dates.
Yeah, and the city would be responsible for tracking these types of things. And I would even revise the ordinance to say, instead of if no action has been taken by the HPO, just to say if no action has been taken within 60 days, because it's really, the responsibility of the city, not really the HPO. And so we can definitely, make sure that processes are in place to make sure that these are getting reviewed.
I just want to clarify, I made a mistake in page 70. The heading for this whole section, it should read design review affecting landmarks and properties located in historic districts. It's not specific to the Boulder City Historic District. It's item number 1 on my C.
Got it.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions about section 7? Can we move on to section 8, demolition of landmarks and contributing properties in historic districts?
I will say, I think there should be a little bit of discussion on the additional requirement to notify property owners within 300 feet of the exterior boundary of the parcel. Not that staff has a recommendation one way or the other, but just with like committee, maybe committee discussion on that.
Sorry, which section, where is that?
It's for the, excuse me, section 1B. Design review affecting landmarks and properties located in the historic districts. And then it says that, notice of the commission hearing for compliance shall be mailed to the property owner and to the property owners and residents within 300 feet of the exterior boundary of the parcel under consideration.
Still don't know where you are.
Sorry, it's on,
Actually, that's section 7.
sorry, are we on a different?
Yeah, we had moved to 8, demolitions. So we're back on 1127.7.
Yeah. It's on page 23 of the,
Oh, so we're back to section 7?
yeah.
Okay. And it's which section, sorry, or which,
1B.
On page 23
Okay.
of your draft.
oh, okay, to property and residents, okay.
Well, I guess it's 24, page 24. It just requires notification also to property owners within 300 feet.
I don't know why I took I got that from another code. I don't know if that's something y'all should look into to determine, what does immediate adjacent property mean? It's replacing immediate adjacent with an actual footage or distance.
I think it would be all of the parcels that are contiguous to the subject parcel.
Yeah, I just think within the within 300 feet kind of makes it harder to determine. For staff.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Michael, don't we have that same sort of provision for, like code amendments and things like that, or, zoning amendments, that it's a certain distance around that area?
Yeah, depending on the zoning decision being evaluated, that determines the distance from the property.
And I'm an attorney, I don't do zoning, but I was just, it was just a different change, and I just thought it just warranted some discussion. I don't,
Well, we can look at that and come back to
Okay.
the committee for a recommendation.
Yeah, I don't think it's as concerning for the designation portion, but it would be for the demolition for sure.
okay.
Anything else within this section?
No.
Going once, going twice. Okay, section 8, demolition. I didn't make a ton of changes here, except for I did add that 300 feet.
I guess I would just like committee discussion on the additional information that the applicant for an economic hardship claim has to provide. Especially like getting written reports of design professionals and analysis of the costs.
Can you tell me which section?
It's section, in this subsection, section 8, so then it's C, subsection C, and then the new G. C1G.
It's on page 28?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, economic hardship, there we go.
So I just think that if a person is claiming economic hardship, I realize, getting written reports of design professionals and costs to rehabilitate. And this is within the committee's discussion. I just think that it should be discussed a little bit further, because that will be a significant cost to get those design professional reports and things like that.
I think that there's been,
Go ahead.
oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, I think there's been instances where people will buy a property with the intent to just tear it down, and not the intent to preserve it in any manner, because it would be more cost effective or aligned in what they're trying to do with the property, and not so much with the building that's on it. So, and if we're talking about doing things that would involve a historic preservation committee, or possible grants for the property, or possible moving the building to another property, I think having that information would be valuable. I'm not sure what the cost of having that evaluation done would be, but I definitely think it would outweigh if there was a significant historic structure. Having that information would outweigh just having the right to just tear it down without any information. I guess that's my thoughts on that one. But I felt like the demolition process as written was kind of confusing. It's repetitive in a lot of places. At least that's what I felt when I read it. So I would really like to have, especially because this is probably going to be the most places where the city might get into some litigation, that it really be looked through with a fine tooth to make sure that, it's all good as far as the process. It's very clear to anyone who reads it.
I guess for your reference to the cost of the reports and analysis, I guess it depends. Or is this something where that cost, if maybe they need to show that there is an economic hardship to do those reports and analysis? And if that's the case, then does the city take on that job for evaluation? it depends on the
I mean, I just,
who the
like,
person is, but I
Yeah.
think, you know, or the developer, I mean, Tracy brings up an excellent point where if it's a tear down just for the purpose of,
I mean, I would just say the ordinance already, so the ordinance requires, you know, for economic hardship, they have to prove the property is incapable of earning a reasonable rate of return in its current or rehabilitated state. The property can't be adapted for any other use. Earnest and reasonable efforts to find a purchaser have failed, and the property can't be, you know, removed or relocated. And then it also says the city shall adopt by resolution separate criteria and review for considering claims of economic hardship. So I just don't know if it needs to be in the ordinance. And also the city also looks at, you know, the purchase date, financing, current market value, form of ownership. You know, I just don't know if it's, I mean, it's up to the committees, you know, I'm just pointing it out as, it definitely probably will get pushed back, when it's brought, but, I think it's within the committee's purview if you want to recommend that sort of thing, and if it's, you'd find it helpful. I was just, pointing it out for discussion, because I do think, that might, and I have no, personal recommendation. I'm just pointing out that it could be expensive, and so one's already claiming economic hardship. You know, that's just something to consider.
I think it is, perhaps it's duplicative.
But we can
I-
look at this whole section.
Roman numeral 1 and 2 under G is pretty similar to number 4A, Roman numerals 1 through 4. I think it's just being more specific, and maybe it's too specific.
Yeah, I thought there were some repetitive issues
Yeah.
throughout the demolition part, but I would just say maybe, you know, they have to show that there's an economic hardship. So how are they showing that? Is it just their word against ours, you know, or, you know, is that really something that can't be done? But I think there is a difference if it was like a developer versus, you know, someone who inherited their parents' building and they just don't have the means or ways to do anything with it. So maybe we could put a line in there that it could be waived. You know, that's in the discretion of the commission, that item could be waived. But I think this whole section needs some cleanup and review.
So the other, I think, reason I put this additional information in here was to emphasize that, and I think you brought this up, Tracy, and that if the owner decides it's an economic hardship, that's based on that doesn't necessarily address structural soundness, I guess. I mean, I guess it's kind of clarifying why the building has to be demolished. And that's where the design professional is hired to do that, rather than if the owner, if, you know, like she gives the example of an owner inherits the property and just says, I can't do it, is that sufficient?
Well, the economic hardship isn't just about, I mean, is sort of another exception rather than the structural soundness. It's really about that the property, I guess, doesn't have a beneficial, I guess it just goes to the policy of economic hardship, because the policy is somewhat different than what you would think by using the term economic hardship. I mean,
How about this? Obviously, this language was put together based on Shippo's review of other similar languages. We can consult with Shippo, find out kind of why these provisions were put in, come up with a couple of the scenarios that the committee has raised this evening, and see how they respond to how to ensure that we're being able to evaluate different situations.
That sounds good. I'll just clarify though, like, what they originally wrote, for instance, the property cannot be adapted for any other use, which is part of their definition of economic hardship, one of the number criteria, but who makes that determination? And that's why I think it's important to have a professional, whatever that is, I don't know. It's just perhaps a combination of a building inspector who decides, oh my gosh, this thing's going to fall down any minute. I would rather have that expertise weigh in on the condition of the building as a factor in part of considering the economic hardship of rehabbing that building because it is so far gone that it can't be adapted. So I think that's where that section fits in, and it's to prevent an arbitrary, I don't mean it like that, owner, developer making that determination without some legitimacy behind it. What would that look like?
So it's not a subjective decision, it's based.
Thank you, that's what I was looking for.
And certainly that information would be helpful to any preservation group that wanted to, assist in rehab of the building or moving the building to another location and rehabbing it themselves. So those are just some other thoughts on that one. But I felt that the 2000 codes were much more clear on the process. And I would like to see if there is a demolition that we add, that they provide a redevelopment plan, that they're not just tearing it down and not have a plan with what's next, but they'd provide one.
Any other questions or comments about this section? Any more comments from staff? Okay, so section 1127-9, minimum maintenance standards. Any comments? Besides what we talked about earlier, making sure that we use the correct, is it routine versus whatever the other word was, ordinary.
I'm going to ask Michael, we have like a historic hotel or an older hotel. I don't know if it's considered historic, but that had some neglect issues. Would this, what's proposed here, address something like that? Because I know staff was having a difficult time with that particular property. Would this mitigate some of that kind of issue?
The challenge is going to be who is the responsible party. Right now, with our property maintenance regulations, putting the owner on notice is part of the concern if you don't have clear title being delineated. So in that particular circumstance, unless we can put other provisions within our code which allows the city to cure some of the problems with enforcement, you're going to still have that issue. And so I think a combination of looking at this and our evaluation of our property maintenance codes, and updating those will be helpful to accomplish the goal.
Okay, so in this one, at the very bottom, it says, if the owner does not respond with a stabilization proposal, the matter is turned over to the city attorney's office for action in municipal court. So in that case, you know, we might be sending it to who we think the owner is, but no, we get no response, you know, if we have an old address or something like that. But the city attorney's office could handle it at that point and deal with it somehow. Is that sufficient, you think?
Well, if there still isn't clear title as to who the responsible party is, that's the challenge. So one of the things we're going to explore with our property maintenance code is to look for mechanisms where the city can address the property maintenance concern and then lien the property for a future reimbursement of city expenses towards addressing the property maintenance issue.
Yes, other jurisdictions, I would say, in their maintenance codes, they have ability to assess fines, and if those fines aren't paid, they can lien the property. In addition to, you know, criminal penalties, which is, you know, for property maintenance type issues, is tends to that should really be a last resort. But currently our ordinances are not. I think that what Michael's saying is the enforcement mechanism is really something not to be addressed in this ordinance, but a broader issue to be addressed among our property maintenance ordinances in general, because when we talk about code enforcement and enforcing both historic preservation obligations as well as other obligations on the part of residents to conform with the code, that those enforcement mechanisms have to be uniform and consistent across the board. So those are just something that staff is already working on separately and will bring to council at a later time.
Okay, so that's my only concern is like the legality and, you know, possible liability on the city with this one and the next section, you know, as a enforcement of it. But also having, you know, but it'd also be nice to have a way to deal with neglect and maintenance issues in the historic sector.
Absolutely, and those should just cross-reference, you know, our other enforcement ordinance, which we would address, and agreed that there are some liability concerns so a full revision of enforcement would be necessary, really, to adequately have the enforcement ability.
I almost feel like if you have existing maintenance standards for buildings, you would add additional, I mean, here's an option maybe to add additional criteria so here's one where the chimney is leaning. If it's on a non-historic building, then they're only charged $50, let's say, as far as a penalty, let's call it. But if it's on a historic building, it's going to cost $100. I mean, that's not exactly what I mean, but I'm just saying, is it, and maybe you've already said this, we might not need to address it here specifically.
Yeah,
but
and
it'll
I
be
would recommend
addressed.
our fines for non-compliance with the code be uniform, because you run into equal protection issues when you start having different penalties based on a classification.
So that wasn't a good example. I guess maybe what I meant to say is there'd be more scrutiny for lack of maintenance on a historic building versus a non-historic building.
Again, I think the government needs to be equitable in that scrutiny as well. Yeah, we have to be even-handed whether it's historic or non-historic.
I think what's key here is that this ordinance provides provisions for enforcement when historic properties aren't being maintained. And so that just helps to clarify the issue.
Okay. Any other comments on this section? Okay. Section 10, 11-27-10, enforcement.
So I do have something I'd like to propose we add to the enforcement section under penalties. So for in the case of midnight demolitions, what's referred to as a midnight demolition, where an owner demolishes a structure or part of a structure without a permit, there's no penalty in place for such a situation. So I would propose that we add language such as any person who demolishes, alters, or constructs a building or structure in violation of this ordinance shall be required to restore the building or structure and site to its original state.
Do you mean reconstruct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we got some great protections here, but then there was a recent example of this back in my hometown recently where a very historic home was demolished on a Friday evening. And the developer was fined $5,000 or something like that. So, you know, which was just a cost of doing business. So this is something that I feel very strongly about. One of the main reasons I got involved with the historic preservation in the first place was the demolition of the old hospital. And I know it wasn't a midnight demolition, but now that we have such, well, we don't have it, but now that we possibly are on the verge of having protections for our historic buildings, I would hate to see there being any sort of a loophole, especially with demolitions, because once it happens, you know. Maybe an excuse could be, oh, he didn't know, and demolished it on a Friday evening by mistake. So whether it was a mistake or not, I think the burden should be on the owner to rectify the situation. I think that would be the ultimate deterrent also to anybody getting such ideas, you know, because it just takes some silly individual to have this idea and then there's no way to reverse it. So I'd like to see a strong deterrent to that type of action taking place. So,
Yeah, we
what
can
do you
look
guys
into
think of that?
Actually, there was another example in San Francisco where somebody inappropriately removed a nationally significant building and they were required to rebuild it, reconstruct it. So.
Yeah, it is a common.
Kind of common.
It's according to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, most preservation ordinances provide for the imposition of civil penalties by courts of law for the violation of preservation ordinance, including the failure to maintain and midnight demolitions. So it's not an unusual item to have in a historic preservation code, but I think if we didn't have it, it would be a major, we'd be overlooking a major deterrent that I feel is, you know, we can't afford to lose any more historic structures in Boulder City, and it's not hurting anyone. If somebody wants to go ahead and do that, then I think they should pay a severe penalty for that. You know, reconstruction is a great deterrent.
We can certainly look into and look at other jurisdictions and what kind of penalties they've imposed on midnight demolitions and things like that, and bring back some recommendations.
Tracy, any comments on this section, enforcement?
No, I just, a legal review just for like the previous one. And yeah, it would be interesting to look into what Member Turner has proposed as well.
Okay, section 11, special restrictions. Section 12, or separability, as well as Section 13, effective date. Any comments on those three sections?
None for me.
So I guess then the next step is for the city to consider the comments tonight and come up with a new revision.
Yes.
Okay. For our next, to then be reviewed at the next meeting.
Yes. And does the committee, typically these ordinances aren't on sort of numbered, what I would call pleading papers, what I call it, but the numbered paper that you put it on to show the lines. But if that's helpful for the committee to like know what line we're discussing, I can do that. Would the committee find it helpful if I use the numbered paper, numbered format, showing the lines on the left margin, showing the numbers?
I'm good with that.
Yeah, whatever. I mean,
Well,
sorry.
I wouldn't typically do it, but if the committee finds it helpful, I'm happy to do that.
You know what,
for
we
the committee.
didn't go through and look at line number by page number, so I don't think we need it.
Okay.
But it would be helpful to maintain, the section,
Oh, of course.
which I know
yeah.
you will,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, if it was helpful, I can put it on that.
I don't think we used it, so,
Okay.
because I wasn't sure how we were all gonna make comments, so, it's not necessary. All right. I think that's it for our next steps for this section. Okay. Agenda item number 4, for possible action, committee discussion and direction on the public outreach process.
So I think it's staff's expectation to begin this conversation with the committee tonight, and certainly until the committee finalizes its recommendation on the ordinance to advance, that would be the appropriate time for the outreach effort. But what we've tried to do is just come up with some different options for the committee to consider on community outreach, looking at different ways to get information out to the community about the proposed changes to the ordinance. So if the committee has any questions or additional ideas, and then we can bring this agenda item back next month.
I think these are all really good options. But yeah, I think we can discuss them at our next meeting.
And certainly in the interim, if you have suggestions and you want to send that to me, I can include that and add it to the list for next time.
Okay.
And the only comment I had was that I think that we need to start out with education first, and rallying up encouragement for this, for pride in the historic district, and just bring it in as a positive note of the benefit to our city that it will provide, and just start off with that first, before we go into just throwing a bunch of codes and regulations at everyone. Just really get the education behind it really grounded first. And I know COVID has caused a lot of problems with having community meetings, but I think those are usually really helpful to facilitate education where people can ask questions and have their concerns heard. But mailers could work as well to kind of provide some education about what's going on, and those direct mailings would probably be helpful too.
I think I might, an option also, when you talk about hosting community meetings, maybe it would be more than one, or it could be targeted to certain areas of the community or neighborhoods. Spread the wealth, I guess, or to maybe address some of the code changes that might affect a particular neighborhood or section of the city. the business folks, folks on the tree streets, the avenue streets, perhaps, is another option. Okay. Moving on to agenda item 5, possible action, committee discussion regarding potential agenda items for next historic preservation ad hoc committee meeting.
Well, I think we clearly have two.
Yep.
Bringing back the ordinance and continued discussion with outreach efforts. Are there any other agenda items the committee wants to consider for the next meeting?
I don't have anything. Tracy, do you have
Yeah.
anything?
Just have the work plan again, probably on there again for review, to keep us on track. But that's, yeah, those, you know, I think those are what Michael suggested were appropriate.
Sounds good.
Yep.
All right, that ends this part of the meeting. Time for public comments. Public comments can be made by calling 702-589-9629. Hearing that there are no public comments, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Tracy.